class, but really in addition, I'm going to be using the Parsha as a springboard for looking at some contemporary halachic situations or contemporary halachic realities. So it's really going to be a synthesis between Parsha, which other people are teaching here as well, and contemporary halakha. The first half will always introduce some nice idea, something you could bring home to the Shabbos table, right? But then we'll segue into a topic that I think is contemporary relevant, has contemporary relevance. So what we're going to start with today is in honor of Yom Aliyah, 7th of Cheshvan was determined 5 years ago by the government to be Yom HaAliyah. I'm seeing puzzled faces, which means those who made Aliyah aren't even aware that there is a Yom HaAliyah. Yes, there is in fact a Yom HaAliyah. And
I'm sorry,
yeah.
We have more people coming in.
Oh, please come in.
And we're out of source sheets.
No, that can't, really? So let me go tell
Is
them.
someone seeing, are there
Let me
more?
go.
Yeah.
So let me tell them.
You know what, you keep teaching.
Okay, I'll keep teaching.
I can handle that.
Yeah, just go tell them to Abigail to send a couple of more to her. So it's Yom HaAliyah, and it is not coincidental that it coincides with Lech Lecha. In other words, the idea is to commemorate Yom HaAliyah right before the Parsha in which we read of Avram's Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. And I love the fact that I live in a country where clearly, again, it's a national platform to encourage immigration, right? That's a religious value and a nationalist value that we have to encourage Jews from around the world to make Aliyah. And we tie it to a biblical text. And I feel like that's just so Israel. And so what I want to look at is a Midrash that to me reinforces the importance of Eretz Yisrael, because how could I not? So we're looking at something from Bereshit Rabbah, Et Elohim Hitalech Noach. In the first source, we have this idea that Noach walked with God, right? We're going to contrast it to Avram, who walks before God, and many commentaries make focus on that distinction in order to differentiate between the character of Noach, who ends up drunk and naked in his tent, and the character of Avraham, who clearly does not and moves upward in his relationship with God throughout his life on a journey that really starts with Lech Lecha. So let's take a look at the Midrash. Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Nechama. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Mashal L'Sar Shahayu Lo Shnei Banim Echad Gadol ve'Echad Katan. So Rabbi Yehuda, we're going to see two parables. Those who have been in my classes before know I love the Midrash. I feel there's a lot of complexity and depth to Midrash. And what we have here is a king with two sons, a grown-up son and a small son. L'katan amar halechi mi, va'amar legadol bo v'halech lefanai. And so what we have here is the differentiation between how we treat a small child, walk next to me, to support the child, to remind the child that we're there, right? It's very important. Hold my hand when we cross the street, right? The child needs to feel the parent's presence to know that the parent is there. Whereas the adult child, and this is very interesting, in the Midrash, the parent does not say, walk behind me. The parent says, walk in front of me. When the child walks in front of the child no longer sees the parent, right? But the understanding is the child knows intuitively, because the child is a grown-up, that the parent is there. The child knows that he or she is a product of the parent. And I particularly like the idea of walk in front of me because it speaks to the continuity that we strive for when we raise our children. That ultimately part of why we have children, part of why we have this instinct to have children, is perpetuation of our religion, of our nationality, of our family, of our genetics, whatever it is. And the child walking in front of me reminds me and him that they are now the next generation walking forward. I have now stepped behind. But I think the purpose in this Midrash, and I'm going to tie it into relationship with God, is that the child is able to walk without seeing the parent, and yet very much is aware the parent is there. And this is meant to be a contrast between Noach and Abraham, that Noach never really evolves or develops into the next stage of relationship with God. The only way Noach can know God is there is if he's hitalech imo, if God is propping Noah up next to him. And that is why at the end of the day, when the flood ends and the ark opens, Noah doesn't have the visceral or the intimate connection, the immediate connection with God. He's meant to go out and recreate and rebirth and restart the world. And he just is unable to do that. And so he ends up very much alone and alienated from a relationship with God. In contrast, Abraham, despite the perils, the trials, the tribulations, the understanding is Abraham continuously feels the relationship with God. And we only have to go to the famous Midrash with the idols that Abraham is aware of God even before God speaks to Abraham. Abraham has an innate, inborn intuition that he is in relationship with God from a very early age, and he does not need the Lech Lecha. That will deepen his relationship with God. That will create more of an intimacy. But Avram already is in relationship. Avram understands God is a parent-like figure, kiviyachol, right? That God is essential to Avram's existence. As a result, Avram doesn't need to see God, doesn't need to hear God to know God exists. And it's interesting, right, that if we go to the parent-child, that God essentially says to Avram, walk before me, because God recognizes Avram's strength. And what else does Avram do? Avram perpetuates God's presence in the world. Someone like Avraham, we sitting here learning about God, talking about God, teaching Torah, learning Torah, we essentially are walking kiviyachol, right, in front of God, and we are necessary in order for the next generation and the one after to be in relationship with God. And I think that's a very deep insight that's coming out of the Midrash. The Midrash often reflects on God's need for man. It's not just Heshel, God in search of man, man in search of God, right? The Midrash often reflects, and we're going to see it very much in the next parable, that God has a need for human beings to recognize God so God's presence can be felt in a pervasive manner in the world. And the difference between Noah and Avraham is that Noah is unable to do that. We spend a lot of time when we teach Noah reflecting on Noah goes into the ark and shuts the ark and doesn't convince others that this disaster is about to unfold because God is going to bring this to the world, right? Avram, we have the story with stone, we have Avram's interaction with Melchizedek, with the king of stone, right? Avram is out there and he is representing what it means to be a godly person. So that's Midrash number one. And the Midrash concludes, did you finally go? You got to search. That as follows, Kach Avram Shaya Kocho Yafeh Hitalech Lefanai Veheyeh Tamim. And that's a pasuk we're going to be focusing on because that's the pasuk that introduces the mitzvah of Milah, that right before God tells Avram about Brit Milah, he already has earned God's trust, so to speak, right? He is going to walk before God. Both God and Avraham will know that Avram is aware of God, and Heyeh Tamim, and the mitzvah of Milah is what's ultimately going to make Avraham even more Tamim than he already is. Okay, we're going to come back to that. What can we do? Noah was weaker. Noah didn't have the same strength. He's compared to the smaller child. The mashal I'm really interested in, and this is the part that gets to Eretz Yisrael, don't worry. Rabbi Nechama Amar, Mashal la'oavo shel melech shaya mishtakea batit aved. The Hebrew is even better than the English, not surprising. The Rabbi Nechama says the parable is about someone who is beloved to the king, ohavo shel melech, right? One who is, it says a king's friend, but it's even more intimate, a beloved, someone who loves the king. And he's sinking in the tit aveh, in thick mud. The king looks out the window, sees his ohev sinking in the mud. He basically says, instead of plunging about in the dark, sticky, thick mud, come and walk with me. Right? So I want to unpack this for the minute. Obviously, the king is God. Noah is the ohavo. Ohev oto, right? So he is beloved by the king, and it seems to me also he loves the king. And he's sinking in the dark alley, in the deep, dark mud of his generation. And if we talk about the generation of Noah being one of Hamas, one of corruption, one of wickedness, right? Noah isn't part of that, but he's sinking fast. He's unable, he's resisting, he's struggling, and God essentially has to pluck him out of there and say, come walk next to me. He does not approach God in this parable. The friend doesn't think to call out to the king, but the king, noticing the trial, the tribulation, the struggle, sees his friend sinking, sees his beloved sinking, and he kind of says, invitation, permission to leave that and come walk by me. Okay, so that's parable number one. And we understand the analogy to Noah. How do ulama Avraham domen? Now this is going to be astonishing in my opinion. Lo avo shel melach shera'at hamelach mahalech bin va'ot ha'afelim. So now the beloved sees the king wandering in the dark alley. The king is now the one who is wandering unseen in the dark alleys. And what does he do? Not the mud. It's a slightly different parable, right? And so because he sees the king, no one else can see the king. It's very dark. But the friend, the Oheb, knows the king is there, feels the king, is aware of the king. He shines a light for the king through the window. Now, before we move into the next piece, it's remarkable. This idea the king who is God is stumbling about in the dark. And it's Avraham who shines a light on the king. So the king, again, if we're using God as the king, which the king is supposed to be God, obviously God sees, but is God seen? And so by shining the light through the window, Avraham makes God visible, right? And then God is going to say to him, you know what? Through the window isn't enough. Let's see what the window piece is. So what does he see? He tzitz hamelech v'ra'a oto, and this is also lovely. Notice how the relationship unfolds. Avraham initiates the relationship by shining the light, so God is seen, and now God sees Avraham and says, wait a minute, right? Where does it start? God in search of man, man in search of God. Talk a lot about this during tshuva, right? This idea that what we do elicits the response in order to be in relationship. We all know this, those of us who are mothers and friends and siblings and daughters and so on. Sometimes you get stuck, well, she needs to start. She needs it. If we're going to be friends, if we're going to have a relationship, she needs to start. And many of us have learned that often the initiator, right, has the ability to deepen or really create a different relationship or even a relationship. And in this mashal, there's no way to avoid it. Avram sees God. God doesn't see Avram until Avram sees God. And now there's going to be this tremendous intimacy, right? So the O'avo shel melech here is the friend loves the king, but the king isn't necessarily aware, right? Wait, because it says here, Hitzitz hamelech v'ra'a oto, amar lo ad she'ata me'ir li derech halon bo v'ha'er lefanai. So if you're already going to shine a light for me through the window, come and shine it for me directly with no barrier in between us. And where is that going to be? Take a look. Kach amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'Avraham, ad shetehei me'ir li ba'aspotamia u'mechavroteha, in Mesopotamia and its surrounding environs, vo v'ha'er li lefanai be'eretz Yisrael. Haduhu dichtiv and so on. I don't know what this last piece shouldn't be there, but so God basically says for us to have a direct relationship without a barrier, come to Eretz Yisrael. That's where if you shine the light on me, it'll be the most focused, the most powerful light will be in Eretz Yisrael, and that's where I want us to be in relationship without the window, without the barrier. And so I'll pause for a moment just to say, those of us who came to Eretz Yisrael, right? That's essentially what we were seeking: a relationship with God, a relationship with Am Yisrael, with Torah Yisrael, without the barrier of Galut. And what a perfect message, right, to take home. That essentially in this Midrash, the awareness, there's something pure and very intense and intimate about the relationship between us and Torah and God and our relationship to one another. And so Avram, he wants Avram shining a light for him in Eretz Yisrael, right? That's where the light, that's where God wants to be most seen in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, comments or questions before we move on? We're now going to go to the significance of Milah, which ties into this Midrash as well. Vayi Avraham ben Tishim Shana v'Tesha Shanim, v'yera Adonai el Avram v'yomer elav ani El Shaddai hitalech lefanai v'hayet tamim. And now we have this idea that Avram was 99 years old. God then appears before him and says, I am El Shaddai, hitalech lefanai v'hayet tamim. So I'm tying this to the previous Midrash, right? But that's what we were dealing with, this idea of Avram walking before God. And being aware of God's presence and the intimacy being in that module of Avram walking before, shining a light before God, allowing God's presence to be more clearly seen, and be blameless. And we're going to talk a little bit in the commentary why Milah becomes the circumcision becomes the way to achieve a tmimut, a wholeness, specifically by removing something. Okay. Edna briti beni uvenecha v'arbe otcha b'ma'od ma'od v'yipol Avram al panav v'yidaber ito Elohim lemor ani hinei briti ita v'yita la'av hamon goyim. And now we begin. The word brit appears a tremendous amount, right? God is establishing a covenant and telling him what that's going to be. V'lo yikareh od et shimcha Avram ve'yesh shimcha Avraham ki av hamon goyim netaticha. And I will say at this point, obviously, Avram doesn't know about Brit Milah, has not yet accepted the Milah, but this is an anticipation that he is going to Hayat Tamim, and his name is about to change from Avram to Avraham, right? So this is almost a prelude, a prologue to the second part of the chapter where he's going to be told about circumcision. We could, I've never done this because I never really read it this way, hold my breath and wonder, is Avram actually going to do it, right? So we all know he does it. But I want to point out there's a hiccup, there's a pause. His name has been changed. He's been told to walk before God. V'hayet tamim. God is gambling to some degree, right? God is assuming that Avram is going to accept what is required of him for a brit. So I've not really thought about that, but of course, b'chira chofshi is a big part of Avram's relationship with God. So we're gonna skip down. So you see a lot. The word brit keeps coming up. V'akimoti briti beini uvenecha, and so on and so forth. And 5 psukim in Vayomer Elohim el Avraham va'atad briti tishmor ata v'zaracha acharecha l'dorotam. Another mention of the brit. Zot briti asher tishmuru beini uvenechem v'zaracha acharecha himol lachem kol zachar. Here comes the command to circumcise. Unamaltem et besar orlatchem va'ya laot brit beini uvenechem. And this act is going to be a manifestation of the brit on the flesh of every male who is going to be circumcised. Don't worry, I am going to talk about women and the fact that women are not circumcised, right? Which is a good thing, right? That we all understand that. However, I will say as I speak, meaning the question of, so where are women in the covenant? I think that's an important question to ask, and we will try to address that. At the moment, I'm focusing on the enormous significance of the brit, that it's going to be, this is the Od Brit, Uven Shmonad Yamim Yimolachem Kol Zakar L'Dorotechem, Yili Bayit Umikna Kesef, Mikol Ben Nechara Shalom Izarachahu, Yimol Yili Beitchal Miknat Kaspacha, Vahitat Briti, Yimol Bivsarchem Levrit Olam. And over again, right, the command to circumcise everyone in the household, 8 days old. And finally, Zachar Asher Lo Yimol Et Besar Lato, Va'arel V'nichrata HaNefesh Hahi Me'ameh Et Briti Hefer. So if you do not circumcise, then that male who is uncircumcised essentially will be cut off. Karet, there is no room in the for an uncircumcised male, unless, what's the exception? This ties in perhaps to the second half of the class, is someone who is in danger of circumcision. What seems to, in the Talmud, they're aware of what seems to be hemophilia, a condition where if a child is circumcised, a child will die. That child may not be circumcised, right? We don't sacrifice our children for mitzvot, even a mitzvah as central as circumcision. But Yomer, and now here comes Sarai. Okay, so I do want to say, even within this chapter, Sarai, who is about to become Sarah, is not forgotten. Vayomer Elohim al Avraham, he's already Avraham. Sarai ishtacha lo tikrat shma Sarai ki Sarah shma. She too is given a hey. Avram becomes Avraham. Sarai becomes Sarah. Uveirachti ota v'gam natati mimena l'cha ben. Uvarachtia v'ayta l'goyim malchei amin mimena yiyu v'yipol Avram al panav v'yitzchak v'yomer b'libo halaven mea shana yivaled v'im Sarah habat tishim shana teled v'yomer Avram el Elohim lu yishmael yechia lifanecha. Avram can't believe that this is what God is telling him. He has no problems with the circumcision, even though he's 99, but the question of Sarah having a child just seems to be beyond the pale. Vayomer Elohim aval Sarah ishtacha yoledet lecha ben v'karata et shmo Yitzchak v'akimoti et briti ito. So Sarah is going to be an integral part of the breed because it's her child that will hakimoti et briti ito lebrit olam l'zaro acharav. It's not Yishmael, right? According to our telling, Yishmael is not going to be the hemshech of the breed, even though Yishmael is going to be circumcised. But it is the son of Sarah who will be a direct continuation of the breed, which certainly includes her in a significant way. We'll talk a little bit about birth and the role of women in obviously perpetuating the species. But we'll put that on the side for now. Okay, and now Beirafti, Otel, and so on and so forth. And then Abraham ben Tishim b'Teisha Shanim v'Yimol b'Sar Lato v'Yishmael b'no ben 13 Shana v'Etzem Hayom Hazeh Yimol Abraham v'Yishmael b'no v'Kol Anshe Beito. And Avram does not hesitate at all, and he immediately goes and he circumcises everyone in his household, including his son, including himself at 99. Not a simple procedure. And so, really, Brit Milah becomes for us from this moment onward the seminal sign of the covenant, and that's part of the liturgy. When we bring a young boy into Brit Milah, we talk about the Brit Milah, right? We refer to it with the word of covenant, and it's a very significant ritual. Are we the only people at the time to be circumcising? The answer is no. The Egyptians circumcised ancient Egyptians. There are paintings that predate the Torah that show a picture of circumcision, but it's of an older person, usually a young man on the cusp of manhood, or a sexual initiation rite, a warrior rite, right? Something to show manhood. What is different here, and is significantly different here, is that it is done at 8 days old at God's command. It's not something that is just a rite of passage. I mean, it is a rite of passage, but it's not a rite of passage reflecting, kind of the strength of manhood. But really, it's not about sexual potency. It's about procreation and perpetuation, and it's at the behest of God. And really an idea that Leon Cass wrote about in his book on Genesis, that Noach is given the rainbow as a sign, but very much in character with Noach, it demands nothing of him. Right? He's given a sign, he's given an oath of a brit that God will never do this again. However, the rainbow demands nothing of human beings. It only reflects the preservation of life, that God is committed to preserving life. In contrast, right, and it fits well with the Midrash we read, the character of Abraham, circumcision is something unnatural. In other words, I have to create it. It's artificial. I have to do something to a body that is essentially perfect. There's no reason to do the circumcision, and it's covenantal. And so we already understand that Abraham is being given a completely different role. His character is able to handle that, and that it emphasizes and sanctifies man's natural generative power, as it also, and I'm quoting Leon Cass, restricts and transcends it. So on one hand, here it is at 8 days old, it's not about sexual potency and it's not about manhood, but it is about the awareness that on one hand, this child will procreate, please God, in the future through the organ on which the Brit Milah is being done, the generative power, but it sanctifies it, right? It takes something and it acknowledges and transcends the potential this part of the body has. And one other note that I'll just share, it obligates fathers. And I liked this idea. It reminds them the son is not simply a male heir that is coming to reflect his ego, but it's a gift. And it already puts responsibility on the parent, on the father, sometimes the mother, right? Today, really both, but responsibility that they are responsible to begin transmitting transmitting the transmission of the covenant of fidelity to God, Torah, and mitzvot right away. And so I think that that is a beautiful idea. The idea that often we do have children because of ego. There is an ego involved. Oh, I want a child who's going to look just like me, who's going to be as brilliant as me, and so on. And by doing a Brit Milah on day 8, we're immediately reminded it's not about us, right? It is, it's hard to get rid of ego, but already there is a tremendous reminder of the responsibility we have for something much bigger than ourselves. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about ideas, particularly in Chassidut around Milah, very powerful ideas. And yet as a feminist, I'm constantly left with the sense of, wait, what about me? Where am I in this picture? How come I don't have the stamp of the covenant somewhere on my flesh? And I think, recently people have begun to ask that question, not because we want to go towards female circumcision, which is not part of the covenant, God forbid, right? That is a mutilation that has no benefit to it. But the question is, again, where are the women? And in the Women's Torah commentary, which certainly is the place to find female scholars asking these questions, one suggestion was immediately God introduces Sarah. Sarai becomes Sarah. Sarah is the child, is the mother who's going to have the first child who's going to continue the breed. So certainly through birth, right? The idea that through birth we are not just necessary, right? We're necessary, we're integral, we are a part of the process. Yes, I liked that idea. I also had a good quote. Did I not write it down here? That we are a fundamental partners in the role human beings have, the role Am Yisrael has to continue bringing children into the world. But as the scholar herself admitted, that's not a complete answer because all women have children, right? It's not unique. Brit Milah is at 8 days is particular to Am Yisrael. It's something unique that we do as a sign of covenant. Even though there are other nations, other cultures that circumcise, we do it because God told us to at a very particular time. All women have babies, right? It's not something particular to Jewish women. And so it's certainly not a complete or an even comparison. However, we do know that the Jewish child is born through the Jewish womb, right? The womb of the Jewish mother. So perhaps the matrilineal descent is what gives women a part, their womb essentially ends up birthing children who will be part of the covenant, the Jewish womb, the womb of the Jewish woman. So perhaps, again, something to think about. I don't always have answers. I like to ask the questions. If anyone finds an answer that speaks to them or that they found particularly resonant, please bring it to me. It's something I think about, especially when we get to Chassidut. And Chassidut is really going to talk about how removing the Orla allows us to really uncover the depths, right? The beginning to uncover the film or the barrier between us and God. And I would like to know, so what are we supposed to do? What allows us to go deeper? What allows us to remove the Orla? I guess we have to do the work on our own without a physical ritual. Okay. What I want to look at next, we're going to go a little deeper into Milah. First of all, there is a passage in, this does not look like, okay, we're going to look at the English, not the Hebrew, because the Hebrew doesn't seem to match up. Oh, it does, but it's all messed up, thanks to Svaria. Who is obligated to circumcise a son? The father. It's the father's obligation to circumcise his son. It's one of the 6 mitzvot that is ha'av al haben, something a father has to do for his son. And this is the first one. And we know that because Avram circumcised his son. And that's going to be in next week's Parshat. And in a case where one's father did not circumcise him, the court is obligated to circumcise him. So I also love this. Just even in terms of thinking of circles and society and what happens when a family is not able to care for their child, who is supposed to step in? And really the next organic circle is the community, right? The Beit Din, which I look at as the Jewish community. So if a father has not circumcised his son, will not circumcise his son, is unable to, there is no father, then essentially the court is obligated. I would say today we look at the mother, right? I know several women who have had children on their own in the last number of years. 2 of them are friendly with, and they spoke very emotionally about organizing a Brit Milah, like what it meant for them as the mother without a father to be organizing the Brit Milah, and how emotional. I was at one of the Brit Milahs, it was done here, and it was very, very emotional. And Brit Milahs in general are emotional, but this idea of a single woman bringing her child into the Brit without a father was a very powerful experience, very emotional experience. So I think today the Gemara couldn't have couldn't have really thought of that. That, again,
Sipporah
circumcises her son. Yes, that's true. But that's a very good point.
That's far from a minor point. I mean,
That's far from a minor point. No, it's
major.
huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's huge. She does it because, that's a very good point.
She saves
So
Moses' life.
there's clearly a precedent.
Yeah, you're right. I didn't think about that. I think because halachically, this passage in Kiddushin absolves mothers of any responsibility. They say a woman isn't obligated to circumcise herself, so a woman cannot be obligated to circumcise her child. I hear that Sipporah narrative is an important narrative, but it doesn't influence the halachic discourse. And it's funny because it just shows my mind often goes to Talmudic and rabbinic and halachic discourse, and I forgot about Sipporah. And of course, Sipporah becomes the model of a mother stepping up when the father is unable, and that's so natural, right? That we go to the mother. Thank you. Absolutely. But what we see here is then the court, and ultimately, and if the court does not do it, he's obligated himself. And again, that's the scaffold. Ultimately, again, it's the parents who are responsible for the child. If the parents are unable, then society, the community comes in and helps the parents or takes the child, lo aleinu. But ultimately, who's responsible? It's the child when he grows up to become an adult. I mean, ultimately, you don't get to say, well, my parents never did that for me. My community never did that for me. I guess I don't have to do it. No, at a certain point, you become responsible. And I liked that layering, right? Initially, it's the parents, as Leon Cass said, that is a reminder to the parent and the child that it's not just about the ego of the parent. It's not just about perpetuating my wonderful genes, right? It's about introducing the child into the covenant in which we are bound by the word of God, by the command of God. It's bigger than our individual selves. But if the parent does not do that, the community who are committed to God's word, and then ultimately the child himself.
So if I know a Jewish boy who is not circumcised, do I, as a member of the Am, have an obligation to make sure he's circumcised?
The answer is yes, but you can't, it's a little tricky. In other words, if the parent, we're going to talk a little bit today about the reason I decided to focus on this topic, and now I'll already give you this, what's coming up. There's an enormous debate today about circumcision, both in Israel and abroad, about anti-circumcisers within the Jewish community, not within the Orthodox community. But it was just in the Jerusalem Post, and Gary Steingart in the New Yorker wrote a very graphic article about his own botched circumcision, which happened to him as a young boy who got out of Russia in, I guess, the 1970s, 1978, I think it was. And Chabad arranged his circumcision. He was 7, and he's suffered consequences from that ever since. And apparently that is not as unique as it should be. And then Chaim later in the Times of Israel wrote a response saying for 8-day-old babies, there are not these consequences, right? We should not think Gary Steingart, as sad as it is that he had this experience, that's the norm. He was 7 or 8 years old, and apparently whoever did it did not, there were more risks. But at 8 days old, this almost never happens. And so it has become a contemporary discussion again, right? Because every couple of months, every so often, someone writes a very disturbing piece. What about autonomy? What about agency? What about mutilation? How do parents have right to do this? In Europe, in Germany, right? Enormous legal debate in one of the cities to outlaw circumcision for children. The idea that a parent should not be allowed to do this to a child without the child's consent. There's no consent and there's no medical benefit to this, right? In Europe, they do not circumcise the way they do in America.
The royal family does.
The royal family does, you're saying.
And they always use the oil.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard
Yes.
that. That's unusual, and I don't know why that is, but in Germany,
Well, they feel the oil is better than a doctor.
yeah, that's great.
They have
Yeah, I think I
more
heard that.
experience.
I've heard that. That's fascinating. In The Crown, I don't remember their bringing that point out, but I've heard that. I heard that recently. It's unusual because in Europe, largely baby boys are not circumcised. In Russia, Eastern Europe, for sure not. It's more in the West. Anyway, notwithstanding, right, this has become a debate, and you've asked a question. What happens if I know a parent is not circumcising their child? What's my responsibility? The bottom line is you can't do anything. You can only do something if there's a baby boy who has no parents, or the parents have no means to pay the mohel, let's say, or to logistically figure out the circumcision, to then step in and say, hey, can I help you with this? That you can do. You can't steal a baby and circumcise them, right?
But you can talk to the parent.
You can talk to the parent, you can try to
influence them.
encourage, you can try to influence their decision, absolutely. And one might even say you have an obligation if you think the parent will listen. I want to make that very clear. If you know, I think, hopefully you don't, today we know that anti-vaxxers, anti-circumcisers, very, very hard to talk to people who have created a wall of no, and anything you say is already going to be misinterpreted, misconstrued, and seen as threatening. So you have to be, if it's an anti-circumciser, you have to be careful. However, I think the responsibility is making things available, right? Trying to present, make it as easy as possible, and so on for people who are struggling to do it. Ultimately, the child grows up and it's his responsibility. I do want to say that. Meaning it's the father's at 8 days, but it's the child's when the child grows up. You only are chayav karet if you die uncircumcised. In other words, you're not chayav karet for living a life uncircumcised, even though you obviously should be circumcised. The penalty of karet is at death. And so that's an important distinction as well.
Babies like stillborns and also
Yeah.
like
Yeah,
young
well,
babies
right.
that haven't had the chance
To bury them.
They do it for the burial. Is that?
So
like,
I don't
it's
think
after death, but
it's after death. I don't know where I don't know.
yes, it's
They do.
circumcised
I
babies
don't-
before they bury them.
Yeah, I think they do. I don't know where that practice comes from or why it's done. I should look that up. That's actually a contemporary issue that's interesting. I will say, I don't believe you're not buried in a Jewish cemetery if you're uncircumcised. I mean, like tattoos, my feeling is that's probably not accurate, right? That we have this, there's a myth that if you have a tattoo, you can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery. That's ridiculous. Meaning, karet, if someone eats on Yom Kippur, we bury them in a Jewish cemetery. And if they eat chametz on Pesach, we bury them in a Jewish cemetery. Not being circumcised is not worse karet than eating on Yom Kippur. In other words, it's the same karet. You've already been nichrat. So it would be surprise me. The only thing you can't do is eat the korban Pesach, as far as I know. I think that's the only thing an Orla cannot do is eat the korban Pesach. But I'm not sure. I don't know where. Sometimes there are rumors. I have to look into the burial and into the what you said about this. I have a friend who, David Brovsky, wrote a book on Avelut, and I'm guessing he probably came across that. I'm sure you're right. I would just like to know, is that halakhic or is that more because it's unbearable to a parent to bury a child? It's not like this idea of the brit is so important.
I think it's the
That-
Chaver Kadisha.
The Chaver Kadisha
I
doesn't.
had-
You have, you know this. Oh, okay, sorry.
No, so the Chaver Kadisha does it.
The Chaver
They
Kadisha
do
does it.
For all
Wow.
baby boys.
So I'd like to, right, I want to know what, right, I want to know the origin of the practice, where that started, because I'm not familiar. Thank God.
I know in Israel, I don't know.
In Israel, yeah, but I'm guessing in Orthodox,
Orthodox,
I'm guessing you're right. If you're
States.
saying in Israel they do it, this probably is, okay, I'm gonna make a note, and if you're, with your permission, I'd like to look into it a little more. Yeah, just is it, is it Kabbalah, is it halacha, I'd like to know a little bit about what the practice is based on, but it's certainly a beautiful idea. And I wanted to look into, what was the other thing? Hold on. Burial in a Jewish cemetery. Okay. I'm guessing I know both, but I'm going to look into it. Okay, let's take a look at the next source. So now we're going to move into Midrash. We're going to talk a little bit more about in Bereshit Rabbah. I always like to go to the Midrash before I begin looking at Chassidut, which I'll be bringing in. I've gotten more into Chassidut of late. Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. So now we have an argument between two Tanaim who often disagree, right? Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva each have their own midrashic schools, and they often disagree. Now let's see if they're disagreeing or they're just having a conversation about Orla. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Avraham Kohen Gadol Haya. Avraham was a Kohen Gadol. Why does he say that? Shne'amar Nishba Adonai v'lo yinachem ata Kohen la'olam. Because in the Kohen la'olam v'ne'amar la'olam v'namaltam et besar orlatchem mehecha nimol. Wait, so what is the connection? Hold on one second. you are a priest forever. Hold on. Oh, I see. We're going to get to it. Somehow the Kohen thing is not quite sitting with me. And Donna's already going to say Kohen Gadol. There aren't Kohanim Gadolim yet. What is the Midrash talking about? I have to be honest, I was more interested in the second half than the first half, but let's keep going. Okay. So this to me is a very interesting process they go through. It's a similar process to the creation of woman. In other words, it's possible I've brought the Midrash where God deliberates where to create woman from so that woman is not problematic and God fails. Meaning in the Midrash, God fails because woman is everything God tried to avoid. She is a gossip and she's a gadabout and she takes the terafim, meaning they bring all the different things, the different problematic qualities of woman, even though woman is created from man. So the idea, of course, is that woman be man-like, and then it'll be easy to work with woman. Woman ends up being distinct and different. So here we're going to ask similar questions. Where should the milah be from? Where should the brit be? Well, should it be from the ear? If you circumcise from the ear, that's one of them. Oh, now I see the Kohen Gadol. That's a blemish that does not allow a Kohen to practice. If you take from a pet, from the mouth, eno kasher lahakriv, min alev, eno kasher lahakriv, mehechan yimol v'yeh kasher lahakriv, ave omer zeh Orla takriv. So this is Rabbi Yishmael. Now I'm going to see Rabbi Akiva does not agree. Has a different drash. Rabbi Yishmael basically says the reason he can say Avram is a Kohen Gadol is not that Avram was a Kohen Gadol. He could be a Kohen Gadol because the Brit Milah was from an area that did not blemish him. Now I'm just going to say that's because Breshit was written before Vayikra, right? So, but the point being made is this wasn't a haphazard decision. As I'm reading it, I instinctively kind of cringe. What, you're going to cut off the earlobe? You're going to cut off a piece of the tongue? You're going to cut off the heart, which obviously they couldn't do heart surgery. Meaning it's making us aware that of all the parts of the body, this is a part in which there's no real medical consequence to it, right? That in fact, the American Pediatric Association recommends circumcision because it's more possible for boys and men to clean the area or not have to clean the area in the same way they would if they were uncircumcised. And it cuts back on certain possible problems with, bacteria and so on and so forth. So there's no downside really. We'll talk about the modern debate, but no downside. And that's where the sign of the covenant is without causing any undue damage, mutilation, harm, and so on. And by bringing the ear, the mouth, and the heart, certainly it reminds me that certain parts of the body could have been a mutilation there or something that actually risked life. If you had gone in to cut out a piece of the heart, we understand that would not have gone well. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Daled or Lotein Ne'emra. Now, Rabbi Akiva says, okay, very nice, except you didn't scaffold it well enough in text. Why even bring up the ear or la ba'ozen? Because there are 4 times that Orla is mentioned with regard to different parts of the body. The first one is the Orla of the ear, right? That's why Rabbi Yishmael, now we understand a little more where Rabbi Yishmael is getting the ear. Hine Orla Oznam, because Yirmiyahu says their ears are blocked. Ne'emra Orla ba'peh. We know that that's the language Moshe uses to describe his speech impediment. V'ne'amar Orla b'lev, v'kol Beit Yisrael arlei lev. V'ne'amar Orla b'guf va'arel zachar. And also we know for arel is used with regard to the bodies, arel zachar, that's an arel who is zachar. So is that talking about an uncircumcised or a zachar who's arel? V'ne'amar lo hitalech lefanai ve'yeh tamim im yimol min ha'ozen eino tamim min ha'peh eino tamim min ha'lev eino tamim u'mehechal yimol ve'yeh tamim have omer zo orlat guf mikra amar uven shmonat yamim yimol lachem kol zachar l'dorotechem. And the Midrash goes on that if you take off a piece of the ear, he's not going to be able to hear. You'll maim him and he won't be able to speak. And we knew Moshe had a problem with speech. Now, it's always interesting when they say the heart, what are they talking about? By the way, cardiac versus brain death comes up in the passage in Yoma. Do they know about cardiac death, right? What do they think the heart is? They don't have the same, they know about the heart, but they don't understand the same function. So here, mina lev eno choshev. So it's interesting, if you cut out a piece of his heart, he's not going to be able to think. Where do you cut? And the person still has the ability to think clearly and to communicate, or la taguf. Amar of Tanchuna istabra hada mikra ba'arel zachar. And now the Midrash continues. What is the arel zachar? Ki yesh arel nikeva. Is there such a thing as arel nikeva? An arel of the nikeva, of the female? Ela mimakom shu nikarim zacharim nikeva. So through this Midrash, we just went through a process by which, first of all, I think Rabbi Yishmael introduces an idea, right, about tmimut, about the body being unblemished despite being circumcised, that circumcision does not create a kind of mutilation and a blemish that handicaps you, right? A handicapped Kohen cannot serve. Number two, Rabbi Akiva comes in and says, wait, let me ground Rabbi Yishmael in text, and now I'm bringing you the 4 instances in which Arel is linked to a body part. And finally, the Arel Zachar gets me to the Arel Zachar as opposed to Nekeva. In other words, the Arel Zachar is because of the masculinity of it. I mean, it's a male ritual, not a female ritual. And I will say I showed and Mishum Mo'alimata, and that's where the circumcision is. Now, I'm going to say, I already mentioned that as a feminist, as a woman, I am bothered by the lack of a parallel, right? But as a woman, I'm also very gladdened that female circumcision is not a rite that we practice. And I showed a wonderful episode of The Good Doctor. Anyone watching The Good Doctor? Yeah. It's about an autistic doctor, right? Very high functioning. It's actually quite well done. I like medical shows. But the episode that I brought to my medical ethics class, and some of you may have seen it, is about a young girl, she's about 16 years old, and she comes to the doctor because she has had a female circumcision, and she was born in America, and her parents are African. And she wants the doctor to correct it. She's in pain. She feels ugly. She feels mutilated. And you end up, and this becomes very interesting if we think about even male circumcision, does she have the right to decide what to do with her body? And they come in and they say, this is a very ancient ritual. It was done to me, says the mother. It was done to my mother. It was done to my grandmother. My grandmother did it to me, right? This is you don't have the right to take away from us what it is that we do. This is our practice. And unfortunately, hundreds of millions, it's really sad, but it is done throughout parts of the Middle East and Africa. It is quite prevalent. It's considered to be like a feminine ritual. Unfortunately, though, the downside is it really creates mutilation and lack of sexual sensation, and it causes all sorts of urogenital problems. Meaning it's a really terrible ritual. It has terrible medical downside. What happens in the show, you see the girl is torn between what she wants to do and her parents, and the doctor overrides her consent and fixes her. She says to the doctor, just do what you have to make the pain go away. And essentially it's to finish what had been started and not done properly. And the doctor is begging her, let me reconstruct, because if I reconstruct, you'll have the ability to have a normal life. And her parents are standing there and she can't, and at some point the doctor talks to her alone, she says no, and the doctor does it. And when she wakes up, she's the only one who she realizes very quickly what's happened, and she turns to the doctor and says, thank you. And it brings up all these questions, again, about informed consent, about autonomy, about the role religion or culture has in decision-making, medical decision-making. It's very, very interesting. But then I turned to the girls after, I said, I have to tell you, anti-circumcisers will use this kind of story and say, so why is it different? Right. And in my kishkas, I'm like, but of course it's different. It's totally different. It doesn't have the medical downsides. It doesn't cause mutilation. A young man is able to have, he's able to procreate. He's able to have sexual sensation and so on and so forth. It's not the same thing at all. But I just want, in the anti-circumcision camp, it's mutilation. How can we do this to our child? Right. So I'm just showing how we can come out as a woman, I'm very against female circumcision. And as an Orthodox Jew, I'm very for male circumcision, right? And I don't find that to be dissonant, but I'm just in the contemporary debate, it is considered to be, it would be hypocritical Like if you're saying no to this, how can you not say no to this? And there's an argument whether men do suffer some sort of consequence for being circumcised. So we'll come back to that. But the reason I even went off on that tangent is because of this last place in the Midrash, which says it's Arel Zachar. It's specifically a male ritual. It is not a female ritual, to which I say thank you to Chazal, right? Because I recognize that throughout the Middle East and throughout parts of Africa, which are very old, right? It's a very ancient practice to practice female circumcision, and we never even considered that. It is continuously rejected. The Torah doesn't even hint to that, and I am grateful that it was recognized that that would be really the wrong thing to do. Okay, so what I want to go to next is Midrash Tanchuma, 2 more Midrashim. Well, actually, we're going to do 1 more Midrash and then see something from the Sefer HaChinuch. וכשאמר הקדוש ברוך הוא לאברהם, התהלך לפניי ואהיה תמים, התחיל תמה, אמר עד עכשיו אני תמים, אם אני מעלה יחסר. So this is again a lovely Midrash. It really gets us inside the head of Avraham. When God says, walk before me and be tamim, Avraham basically says, what do you mean? I thought I was tamim. Now you're asking me to make myself chaser. Think about what you're asking me, God. You said, hey, tamim, but I am tamim, right? At the moment that you said to me, hey, tamim, my body is whole, my soul is whole, right? If you ask me to remove my foreskin, aren't I going to be lacking something? Aren't you removing something from me? So what does the Midrash continue? Chamesh arlotim. There are 5 orlot. Arba ba'adam ve'echad be'ilan. Arlat ha'ozen we saw, right? So Midrashim often build on one another. Arlat ha'lev we saw. Arlat lashon arel sfatayim. Okay, Arlat basar, that's the milah. And finally, the Orla that we know, trees have Orla as well. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ma ata savur she'ata tamim shalem, ata chaser mechamisha ivarim. So the Midrash now comes up with this idea that being Arel is not to be lacking. Really, right now, you're lacking. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ad shelo tamul hayashimcha Avram. Aleph echad, bet shnayim, reish matayim, mem arba'in. Hare matayim ba'arba'im v'shalosh. This is a great gematria, and this again is very reflective of the medical science. They say, look, there are 248 limbs in a man. Women actually are thought to have 4 more because of the pelvis. They thought women had 4 more bones than or limbs than men. And men, your name is only 243. If I add a hey to you, it becomes 248. And I'm only going to do that if you circumcise. So really, again, what I want to bring out in this Midrash is that Avram himself, we have the hiccup that I talked about, that moment where he's being asked to remove something of himself physically. That's not a simple moment, right? And I think, certainly for mothers, Brit Milah is difficult, right? You're causing a wound, you're removing something from this perfect child. And Avram hiccups. And he says, wait a minute, I don't understand. Removing the foreskins, what's going to make me whole? I am whole. And God says, no, I'm going to give you a hay. The hay will make you whole. Well, 248, whatever it is. But really, I think it's the inner dialogue that I find so interesting. Take a look at Sefer HaChinuch. Sorry that the name dropped. You can write it in if you have a pen. It is from the roots of this commandment because God wanted to establish in his nation that he separated to be called by his name a permanent sign on their body, to separate them from the other nations in the form of their bodies, just like they are separated from them in the form of their souls, the going out and coming in of which are not similar. He established this difference in the golden fountain because this is the reason for the existence of people, besides being a completion of the physical body, as we mentioned. I don't know what the golden fountain refers to unless it's so obvious that, okay. God wanted to complete his plan with the chosen nation. I have to see the Hebrew. He wanted men to complete the creation of his body as he did not create him complete from the womb. To hint of him that just like the completion of the form of his body is through him, so too it is in his hand to complete the form of his soul by refining his actions. So I love that. And that really ties into this idea, right, that Leon Kass brought that I've been developing, that it's the action of Avraham, right? That's what creates the connection to God. That's what creates the covenant. Dafka, we're born with the ability to create the covenant by removing that piece of ourselves, right? That's the interplay between God and human beings. We are not passive in that relationship in any way. And the brit, which God constantly talks about as being formed and created and committed to, is really established when we buy in and do something, right? I'm going to suggest that it's not just the Brit Milah. Of course, it's all mitzvah. Every time we do a mitzvah, essentially, we are establishing Brit. But there's something very visceral that is manifest in the Milah. Take a look at Tazria, and this is a very famous, turn to page 7. No, it's probably not page 7. Turn to page 7. I want to talk about the argument between Tyrannus Rufus and Rabbi Akiva, and it has to do with the Brit Milah. It's a famous machloket. Maaseh, right. So we're up to Maaseh Shesha'al Turnus Rufus Harashad Rabbi Akiva. And Eza Ma'asim Na'im Shal HaKadosh Baruch Hu Al Shal Basar Vadam. Amar Lo Shal Basar Vadam Na'im. So they get into an argument, and this is very much the argument between Judaism and Hellenism. Hellenism thinks the natural world is the ideal, is the perfect, and the human world is flawed. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, that the natural world in many ways is static. It's the humans who have the ability to elevate, to transcend, to do things, right? So so basically Rabbi Akiva says those of human beings. So Tyrannus Rufus then says, what about Shemayim Va'aretz? Yachol Adam la'asot kiyotzei b'hem? Can human beings create heaven and earth? And so Rabbi Akiva says that's what you're going to. Lo tomarli b'davar shu lamala min habriyot she'ein shaltin alav. I'm not interested in going to the cosmos. That's above us. That's irrelevant. Heaven and earth, that's what you're going to. I want to look down here on earth. What is it that we're able to do? And I want to look at things that we have control over. So Turnus Rufus then said, Rabbi Akiva, then the next question is, well, why do you lama atem muvin? Why do you circumcise? Amar lo ani hayiti yodea she'al davar zeh ata sho'aleini. I knew you were going to ask me that, says Rabbi Akiva. Like that was an obvious question. And that is why I preempted you and said the works of human beings are greater than the works of God. And the example that comes up is Rabbi Akiva says he brings out wheat and flax, and he basically says to him, what is more beautiful? Wheat and flax. Why is this not here? It should be here. Or if it's not here, then here it is. But is it in English? Hold on. It's not in English. It must have gotten cut, but it's in the Hebrew. So basically, Rabbi Akiva brought out sheaves of wheat and cakes, and he says to Turnus Rufus, "Which do you prefer?" Turnus Rufus, of course, the cakes, the bread, and he says, "Well, the wheat is God, and the cakes are in the hands of humans." And he does the same thing with flax, linen, and clothing, right? And he says, basically, it's Bereshit. Our ability is to go out into the world and transcend, elevate, improve what the natural world represents. And really, this is a very fundamental philosophical conversation. I will say, I just have to say, there's a great Midrash that says men need women, right? A man without a woman is below Tov, and so on and so forth. A man will bring home the wheat. Will he be able to eat the wheat? A man brings home the flax. Will he be able to wear the flax? But he marries a woman so that she can turn the wheat into bread and turn the flax into clothing, and then he will survive. It's basically a man cannot survive without a woman because he wouldn't eat and he wouldn't be clothed. So I find it interesting that Rabbi Akiva brings the flax and brings the wheat. He leaves out the women part, right? Maaseh Yedei Adam. Really, it's the women who are transforming these things into the applied the pieces that allow us to survive, at least in these two cases. So now they get into a question about Milah. And basically he says as follows, it is here, wheat spikes and white bread, right? Now they get into a conversation about, okay, you bring Milah. Why is it that a child does not emerge circumcised? Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, what about the umbilical cord? You emerge with the umbilical cord, and you have to cut it, or neither the baby nor the mother will survive. In other words, what you're suggesting, Turnus Rufus, is first of all ridiculous and impossible. In other words, we as human beings have to modify the natural world, or we can't survive. The wheat, the flax, and the umbilical cord has to be cut. You can't leave the umbilical cord. And so he basically says, that already is a sign that from the moment we're born, there are things we have to do. And in this case, God loved us and gave us mitzvahs to purify ourselves. You have to cut the umbilical cord so the child can emerge as an individual human being into the world. And you have to do the Brit Milah because that's part of also emerging as an individual human being into the world, a world in which we are committed to God's mitzvah. And he even uses this, l'tzarefo tam bahem, right? God gave us mitzvot in order to purify ourselves with the mitzvot, and not just Brit Milah. So Brit Milah becomes an example of the paradigm in which we relate to God, that God gives us mitzvot so that we can become tamim, so we can l'tzaref et atzmenu. And the last pasuk, the last thing is David Amar Imrat Adonai Tzurufa, which to me really expands this model of tzrifut, of purification beyond milah. In other words, the word of God is what's pure. Following the word of God, applying the word of God every time we do a mitzvah, that kind of mini revelation that occurs when we do mitzvah, or that mini covenant that's established every time we do a mitzvah. The difference with milah is once you do milah, it's there forever. In other words, that is a sign on the flesh of the young boy. That doesn't preclude all of us from doing mitzvah, and every time we do a mitzvah, we're also purifying ourselves and improving, transcending the lives that we live, the food that we eat, the clothing that we wear, and so on. Take a look at the Klei Yakar. I want to look at 3 more sources, which I think I'll be able to get through. And you shall guard my covenant. The essence of the commandment is for the sake of their sons, for they need milah of the externality in order that by means of this, they can come to a milah of the internality and purity of the heart. And God repeats this issue many times to teach that the essence of the reasons of the external milah is to reveal by this means the purity of the inner heart. Okay, and so this idea of the external and the internal, it's not just Brit Milah, but Brit Milah is a place where we can most concentrate or reflect upon the need to remove something external in order to go internal. Take a look at the Sfat Emet. Uve mitzvot milah talui kol mitzvot. So basically, milah is talui. All of the mitzvot are the mitzvah of milah. In other words, the mitzvah of milah has its own uniqueness, but really, uve mitzvot milah talui kol mitzvot. Let's see why. Lahasir ha'orla sheyitgaleh ha'pnimiyut. So this is very chassidut, right? To remove the orla, the foreskin, however, whatever it is, and reveal the inner self. So it's not enough to just do milah, you have to do priya. I'll explain priya next week, and then next week we're going to continue because we're going to look more at the contemporary conversation next week. Priya is the membrane under the foreskin that also has to be removed, and basically the Sfat Emet says without the priya there's no milah. In other words, you have to fully expose the inner. ובוודאי באברהם נתקיים בשלימות וכמו שכתוב מיד אחר המילה וירא אליו אדוני, that's next week's parsha, כמו שכתוב במדרש מבשרי אחזה אלוקי, אבל הקדוש ברוך הוא כרת ברית לאברהם להיות כל בני ישראל הנימולים יהיה להם חלק בברית הזה. All bnei Israel who are nimol become part of the brit that was nichrat with Avram, and I think we feel that. We even talk about Avram at the brit, right? The idea that every time a brit is done, it ties back. I mean, there's this thread that unravels into forever every time we do a Brit Milah that connects us to Avram. Liot lachad Elokim, and so on and so forth. And really the mitzvot in general, their purpose is to reveal the inner pnimiyut, let's say, of the physical world. Again, a very strong idea in Chassidut. And a removal of a part of ourselves allows us to become whole. And I think that idea speaks to me because a lot of times we do have to, suppress a part of ourselves in order to be in relationship with others. Sometimes we have to remove a part of ourselves, but it's not a simple thing to do, and it's not a simple idea. And so I'm just going to put that out there, but I'm not going to. I'm going to leave it for reflection. One last source, Yotam Tulub from 929. He is an activist and a lawyer on part of the disabled. I don't know if anyone knows him. He does wear a kippah in the pictures I saw. But I think he writes something very moving, and with this, I'd like to conclude. A week ago, I was privileged to bring my son into the covenant of Abraham. This is the nice way to say that I invited all of my acquaintances to see how they take a little slice from my son's body. I have friends who pray for the birth of daughters just so they do not have to deal with circumcision. And if a boy is born, they hope he is born circumcised. And if he needs a circumcision, then they call a doctor to do it. Everyone around me still chooses to circumcise their sons, 94% according to the Goldman survey. He's in Israel. But I hear more and more grunts on the way to the circumcision. Many of my friends sweat quite a bit to explain to themselves why they decided to circumcise their son, because of tradition, because of the Nazis, because of social pressure. Sometimes what needs to be done with particularly difficult questions is not to answer them, but to ask a completely different question instead. And I think the interesting question is not why I circumcise my son, but what happens when I circumcise him. A week ago, I found out what was going on. I participated in a religious ceremony in the time-honored sense of the word. This is a meaning that is gradually being lost in a time when choosing to be religious is based on what's in it for me. Observing Shabbat is social, sitting Shiva is psychological, modesty expresses innocence lost. In modern times, religious laws have become passé and have gotten away from the notion that they are a divine command. So here's a slice of a commandment that defies logic. When I circumcised my son, I felt for the first time in ages that I am observing mitzvot, not only because they are worthwhile, not only because they are healthy, I observe mitzvah because this is what God commanded. And I think that ultimately that is what, Avram.
Is this man a rabbi?
No, not at all. He's a lawyer and an activist. Not at all.
Oh.
No. He's not a rabbi.
I was like,
Right.
that is really sad that a rabbi said, I just deserve their mitzvah because it's what God commanded. Okay, sorry.
No, he's not a rabbi. He wrote for 929, but I believe he's from within the Orthodox community. So I saw pictures of him. He's wearing a kippah. And basically what he's saying is a lot of our doing mitzvah today is justified by eating kosher is healthier, right? And dressing, we find external meanings to justify or rationalize or give meaning to the mitzvot. And he said, you can't do that with Brit Milah. I mean, we do it just because God commanded us to do so. Otherwise, in many ways, it makes no sense. It's about being in relationship with God. The last page 10, that Ruth Sohn, I want to come back to Sarah. I'll conclude with Sarah. I brought Yotam because I think he said something that, because I'm thinking deeply about what contemporary Jewry is thinking, particularly in America, right? It was unthinkable, right? The conservative movement, by the way, will not allow you to join their synagogue if you are adamantly uncircumcised, right? The Reform movement will, reluctantly, they prefer circumcision also, but this is beginning to be an issue in the States. It's an issue here as well. My father and my sister-in-law has a sister-in-law who adamantly did not want her son to be circumcised. The child is 4 or 5 years old. It was an enormous fight with her husband. She was livid, she was furious, she was angry, she felt betrayed that he insisted on circumcising their son. They live up in Rosh Pinah, and she has a group of like-minded people. They're anti-vax, anti-circumcision, all holiness, organic, and right? But the tradition means nothing. And so it's happening here as well. I don't want to tell, oh, well, in Israel, that's not happening. It's happening everywhere because we're so focused on autonomy, right? Autonomy, consent, my body, and how can I be asked to do something to my body just because God said so? And so I'm pained. And that's why what Yotam, that was his name, writes is important, because he is not part of the yeshivish crowd, right? He's part of this very liberal, it seems to me from his writing, demographic that are beginning to question this very primal central ritual that is all about covenant and submission to God. I do want to end with Sarah because I think she deserves it. And if we were talking about Yom HaAliyah, she made Aliyah also, right? So let's acknowledge her Aliyah as well and her sacrifice. And the fact that she was in relationship with God, but did not have kind of the validation that Abraham has. And so she in some ways is walking in front of God, right? But without being told to shine the light, but she's there and she's very much aware of God's presence. Is Sarah part of the brit that God establishes with Abraham? God makes clear that not all of Abraham's descendants are part of this covenant, only the ones of Sarah. This underscores Sarah's crucial role. It makes Abram and Sarah, physically speaking, partners in the covenant. In a sense, the greatest sign of this covenant is the fulfillment of God's promise that Sarah will bear a child. Perhaps women after Sarah, as the ones bearing life, carry on the covenant between God and Abram and Sarah's descendants in the most basic physical way. maybe circumcision is a male ritual to include men in a physical way in the covenant that women make real in their flesh when they bear the next generation. So I really liked the way she wrote that, even though I already said, look, every woman has a job, but there's something very powerful about the synergy, the partnership between man and woman when we come together to participate in the covenant together. So thank you very much, and now happy to take some questions.
Glad you didn't end with Caesar.
No, next week, right, next week, if you'll come back, I promise I'll.
Part of the problem today, yes, it's fine to say upon is this selfishness. Everything's about me and everything's about what I want,
Right,
what I feel and what I do. And God has gotten lost. I think
Yes,
that's one of the
yes,
reasons in
yes,
America.
yes, yes,
They're trying to do away with religion.
Right.
The
Yes.
Christianity is suffering as much as Judaism in America.
yes, religion is really
It's
suffering.
because everything is my decision, because it's all about me. I don't have to concern myself with anybody else.
Right,
Just me. I'm the only one that counts. I'm the only one that's important, and nobody else counts.
Right.
And that's the.
yes, the
That's
focus
the
on self, the
destruction of
worship
the
of self.
fabric of
Worship
society.
of self, I agree with you. It's
And
very,
that's
very
what's going on
concerning.
today.
It's very, very
That's the
concerning.
idea when I read it.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, Israel's still behind America, but America's gotten.
It's
I
like-
realized when I was sitting here that I never learned Midrash. Hebrew school, and day school.
Really,
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't know, maybe that's true today, even so, no, also.
yeah, there's a lot of interesting interpretation.
By the way, I told you I spoke to, I didn't speak to her, it's on WhatsApp. Natalia,
Yeah,
and I had a few exchanges, but I never got a piece of solid information.
I don't think I changed.
Yeah.
She said she had to pay tuition 2 hours a day.
yeah, so I hope she did that.
She didn't say where. She just said it was something, Hebrew University, Tel University.
Economics.
And I said, what is that? She said, "That's-
You're so awesome, Ashley.
There's nine more. There's no God in and what am I gonna say?
I have not.
I wanna know.
So in America,
I think it's over.
Yeah, I'll see what I can find out, Joe.
Yeah, you know, it's been a long time.
Yes, it was.
Can she hear us too?
And even the conservative movement is up in arms about this group that are anti, because they will not allow. They will not allow.
Hello.
It's interesting that that's
Can
all.
somebody hear the people on Zoom? Can the other people on Zoom hear each other on Zoom?
People are either going to modern Orthodox or.
I can hear you.
I have a single-handedly is trying.
Okay. I wonder
Maybe because
if she could hear us, if we could ask questions also like the other people
Yes,
in class.
It's important to check that out because otherwise we don't feel an integral part of the whole thing.
Exactly. I feel completely left out of the class dynamics, and there are things that, you know, when she asks questions, I would want to answer. I want to ask her a question,
Yes.
and I can't do it.
I raised my
And we
hand
also don't hear
chat,
questions,
and there's
comments
no
from other people.
response.
Exactly. I wrote to them. We don't hear their questions, nor do we hear their answers. I
Right?
mean, in this class, it was
I think
less
we
than
all-
other classes because she talked almost the whole time. But I've been in classes where, you know, the lecturer is asking questions and is hearing comments, and I can't hear them.
Yeah,
agree
I
with
found
you,
that
Donna.
definitely-
I agree with you.
I think we all need to write to Matan and I think I'm going to write to Yael Ziegler. I think she's in charge of things there. And we're all paying the same, so we should have the same experience.
Exactly. It's.
I agree.
Yeah.
Exactly. I agree 100%.
Go back.
That's amazing to know.
But then someone about it, they keep kosher and they keep and they do all these.
Okay, so everybody write letters or emails or something.
But you just say circumcision.
Wait, who's speaking? Because there are no pictures almost. Who just talked?
I'm speaking. Done.
Esther Zuckerman also agrees with you, Donna.
What?
I'm Esther Zuckerman and I wrote a chat and raised my hand and I agree with you.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see your hand. Okay.
I also agree. It's Susie.
Oh, hi, Susie.
This is Ilana. I agree with you as well. I feel very strongly about it.
Yeah, me too. So what can we do to make it happen?
It's in all the classes. It's a problem. I don't know if they know how to,
I don't know, and I don't.
because the way the class is set up,
Today is.
No, it's supposed to be hybrid from what I understand.
Correct.
And so there has to be some acknowledgement of what we're saying also.
yeah,
I agree. Last year, when all the classes were only Zoom, the people that were Zooming could ask questions, could make comments, etc.
because it was, Donna, it was set up differently.
So they can,
No, I just had, they were opposite a screen at
right.
that time.
No, but
Now, I went to one class and I saw how it is. There's a camera on the ceiling facing the lecturer, but the Zoom, the actual screen is to the side, up on the side, so that the speaker, the lecturer, when they're speaking into the camera, they don't even see the screen.
Or maybe
And
there's a way of changing that. So
I know,
that
Correct.
and also everybody's muted for the whole class. It doesn't.
Right, right. And that's no good. I mean, we weren't muted when all the classes were on Zoom. We shouldn't be muted now.
Donna,
There was a different,
I heard they were supposed to relate to the Zoom people at the end of the lesson in order not to have too much confusion, but they don't
Right.
relate to us at the end.
No, they don't.
You are